Larry Scott. The night, time stood still. Saturday, September 18th, 1965. Brooklyn Academy of Music, New York City. In the bodybuilding world of the 1960s, he was 26, 5'8", and weighed 215 pounds. A cerulean-eyed blonde with toothpaste-ad teeth and skin like glowing gold. He had risen, narrow-shouldered, underweight, and unknown from backwoods United States to become Mr. America and Mr. Universe. His being transcended racial, social, and economic boundaries. He numbered among his legion of worshippers, political leaders, and movie stars. He was Larry Scott. Scott's memorable victory in the first Mr. Olympia in 1965 is one of the foundation stones of modern-day bodybuilding. Years after he had transformed a normally possessed bodybuilding audience at the Brooklyn Academy of Music into a heaving, screaming mass of crazed humanity, those who had witnessed the event would speak of it in tones usually reserved for recounting biblical miracles. And you could tell by their attitude in relating their story that they considered themselves very special indeed, a cut or two above extraordinary, for having been there on the night that Larry Scott was crowned King of Bodybuilding. Admittedly, it had been a great night. Joe Weider had devoted page after page of his Muscle Builder magazine to publicize the newly minted Mr. Olympia event. Although television was not then on friendly terms with bodybuilding, the word got around that this was to be the greatest of all muscle extravaganzas. Joe Weider had claimed that all the super champions of the day had been invited to appear at the Brooklyn Academy. He named names: Reg Park, Bill Pearl, and the various NABA Universe winners. Even John Grimmick, York Barbell's shining in the East geriatric but still dreaming star, had ostensibly been asked to come out of the cobwebs that night in 1965 to prove his vaunted superiority. For Joe Weider had conceived the Mr. Olympia as the bait to draw the retired champions back into the arena. They had quit because finally there were no new worlds to conquer, and now many were rusting on laurels, content to tell stories of past glories and to throw out sarcastic remarks about the reigning champions of the day. Astute bodybuilding promoter that he is, Joe fully expected the return of the golden oldies, the Parks, the Grimacks, the Clarence Rosses, and who could tell, Steve Reeves to set the collective bodybuilding imagination afire. Fans of pre-IFBB bodybuilding would surely come out to jeer those followers of modern-day bodybuilding, who were not yet dry behind the deltoids and had never seen a real champion in action. Thus ran the rationale behind Weider's advertisements. On Mr. Olympia Day, the theater was packed. Backstage, however, it was a slightly different picture. Empty. For Park, Pearl, and the other retired champions had finally decided to stay retired and safe in their cob-wedded cocoons. They had chosen not to come and step under the posing lamps against Chuck Cypes, Harold Poole, and Larry Scott. In the audience, no one knew for certain who would be competing. While they knew Scott would be there for sure, Harold Poole also, for the two had been battling for bodybuilding supremacy for 3 years. And now that both had become Mr. Universe, there was only one direction left to go. The winner of the night's Mr. Universe contest was also slated to try his luck at the Big O. Then Bud Parker, who had emceed both the Mr. America and Mr. Universe contests earlier, came on stage to announce the names of the contenders for the newest, most prestigious honor the world of bodybuilding had to offer. He called out the names of Scott, Poole, and Earl Maynard, who minutes earlier had been declared Mr. Universe. And then he said that even though a galaxy of retired stars had been invited, only Chuck Cypes had chosen to come out that night. Clearly, Parker said, the old-timers had now admitted the superiority of the current heroes. At last, the first contender for the Mr. Olympia title was under the posing lamps. Earlier, Earl Maynard had earned a rousing ovation with his prize-winning musculature. Now, however, he had sunk to the depths of déjà vu. It was as if the panting audience no longer wished to view even extraordinary reality. No, what they now hoped to glimpse was the impossible, and clearly Maynard was still too human to pass for that. In truth, as he posed on the Mr. Olympia stage, this man who had earlier been declared Mr. Universe amidst sustained applause appeared ordinary, and something in the coolness of the hand clapping that greeted the final movement in his stage routine reminded you of 1922 Emily Post and Manners. The man who replaced Maynard on stage was a dad of whom any conservative son would be proud. Chuck Cypes was a gentleman, everyone said. He was admired far more for his demonstrations, nearly inhuman power, than for his physique, even though in his time he had won such coveted titles as Mr. America and Mr. Universe. The muscle magazines were always reminding readers that Chuck was more than 40 years old, as if to suggest he was a miracle worthy of special attention. And, say it straight, on most nights the age factor was enough to earn him vociferous applause. Not at the first Mr. Olympia, however. True, he displayed massive forearms that seemed to have been painstakingly carved from redwood, curved here, knurled there, clearly a repository of inestimable strength. His thighs and calves might have been the models for the lower half of the Farnese Hercules, yes. And his posing, never remarkable, tonight was smooth and professional. But somehow Chuck Cypes did not take your breath away. You never once forgot as you watched him offer his presentation that he was human, flesh and blood, like yourself. He was not so awesome that his appearance twisted your consciousness, till you were tottering on the brink of hallucination. The magazine ad said you too could be Mr. America or Mr. Universe, like Chuck Cypes if you followed a certain bodybuilding course, and watching Cypes you believed the ads. A few minutes went by before Bud Parker announced the name of the next contender. And now the impatience that for nearly an hour had been bubbling in its veins was threatening to burst loose from the normally controlled audience. The fans knew only two names were left, and could hardly bear waiting to hear who would be first under the posing light, Harold Poole or Larry Scott. Suddenly the pace had changed from pedestrian to sprint. Harold Poole was a trailblazer in bodybuilding, inspiring a generation with his dedication and charisma, much like Muhammad Ali's transformative presence in boxing. He viewed his bodybuilding competitions as more than just personal challenges. His intense rivalries, particularly with Larry Scott, carried high stakes, and his losses resonated deeply with his supporters. The weight of being a trailblazer in the sport began to influence Poole's performances, as he carried the hopes of a generation inspired by his strength and determination. At last, Bud Parker put the audience out of its misery. He announced that the third Mr. Olympia contender of the night would be Poole. Whistles, jeers, cheers, and rock concert screams greeted the star's appearance. He walked with measured steps to the posing plinth, placed himself carefully under the lamp, for he had learned from experience that it was important to use its light to best advantage. The less accomplished contender ignored the posing lamp, and very often lost himself, and a title under shadows that obliterated his muscle separations. With the ease that came from long practice, Poole offered his first pose, facing the audience, thighs tightly locked, hands clasped. Here, from neck to ankle, was the incredible, impalpable form. His pectorals bunched up and split. The broad abdominals stood out clearly from the intercostals, and thick bands crisscrossed his thighs. Poole was massive as never before, and as cut as a lightweight gymnast, even though at 5'11" he weighed more than 200 pounds. A shift of the feet, and he was into his famous side chest pose, pectorals perched on his mountainous ribcage like sentinels on duty. Now he smiled for the first time, and the audience noise rose decibels higher. Now the fans were making their demands. "The back, Harold, the back!" And, with the slightest movement, Poole turned so that 3/4 of his incredible back, along with the jagged deltoids and the rounded biceps, stood out under the soft stage lighting like the inked form of an overdone Marvel Comics hero. Always noted for his lower body development, Poole then shifted position to show massive and clearly defined leg biceps and gastrocnemius muscles, finely separated from the soleus. His muscle control was nothing short of incredible. At last, the final pose that would bring the audience to its feet. The crab, the one that was fast becoming known as the Poole pose. For a second he stood facing the audience, hands at his sides. Still, a smile, then a slight movement as if he were about to bow, enough to signal what was to come. All at once, Poole had transformed himself into a vision from Greek mythology, every muscle bunched up and rigid under his brown skin, demanding more and more applause from an audience sky high on adrenaline. A full minute after Poole had disappeared into the wings, the fans were still screaming. That was the act Larry Scott had to follow. Even before the MC had introduced the next contender, pandemonium had taken over the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Resplendent in blue mohair, Parker had gotten no further than "Ladies and gentlemen from California," when the auditorium erupted in screams. La-ree, la-ree, la-ree. All that had gone on before, the roaring enthusiasm that had greeted every Poole movement on the Mr. Olympia stage, the whistling and the uninhibited demonstrations of love, that was now a tea party for old English ladies compared to Scott's reception. And the star still had not actually appeared on stage. All at once it dawned on Parker. Something in the well-oiled motor of the Mr. Olympia organization had gone askew, for by this time Scott should have been walking up to the platform. Bud Parker, seasoned performer that he is, decides to trick the audience and play for time. He tells them over the microphone that Scott will not appear until they have quieted down. Clearly, Parker is not thinking. For the ant does not order the aardvark to cease and desist. Tweety Bird does not bait Sylvester the cat. Now the audience is berserk. 6,000 angry feet begin to stomp the floor in some kind of nightmarish "One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest" unison. Who knows what horror instruments are banged against the theater seats and the walls. Balled-up paper cups and programs rain down upon the stage. A new chant rises from the auditorium. "We want Scott." 2, 3, 4, we want Scott. 2, 3, 4, we want Scott. Introducing soul and rhythm to the chaos. Still, Larry Scott does not appear. The star is indulging every inch of Greta Garbo in his ego. "Let them wait, let them want, let them need," says the voice in Larry's head, when at last Scott decided to materialize his appearance. Though nothing less than awesome was nevertheless anticlimactic. For you knew in advance that Poole was destined to take second place. That not even the most imaginative of artists could have dreamed up this vision of masculine perfection. Indeed, the Mr. Olympia title was Scott's to collect in his own time. Larry Scott repeated his Mr. Olympia victory in 1966, amidst scenes similar to those recalled. Then in 1967, having escaped Sergio, the myth Oliva, by the skin of his teeth, Scott announced from the stage of the Brooklyn Academy of Music that he had decided it was time to retire from competition in order to have more time for his family. Little was heard of him throughout 1968. In 1969, Joe Weider ran a feature in Muscle Builder that showed Scott with his Japanese wife and their dogs enjoying the comforts of their home. Scott was quoted as saying he still maintained an interest in bodybuilding, the sport that by then had made him a rich man. His courses were still in great demand, and the money from endorsements poured in despite his hiatus from the sport. In 1970, he showed up at a North Hollywood party given in honor of an East Coast bodybuilder. With his wife seated at his side, Scott talked of his faith and his decision to devote time to spiritual development, now that physical development held no great attraction for him. He appeared thin and pale. The once blonde and pampered hair had become a comparatively neglected and sparse brown. Scott told friends it was hard to believe that he had considered bodybuilding titles so highly 3 years earlier. For now, the whole thing appeared to be little more than food for an insatiable ego. He promised never to return to competitive bodybuilding. But Scott returned in 1978 to compete for Warren Langman's Diamond Cup. Perhaps the unbridled ovations that he had received every time he appeared among bodybuilders had something to do with his appearance at the Canadian event. Scott had earlier made appearances at Columbus, Ohio, where he had been invited by Arnold Schwarzenegger to judge the Mr. Olympia contest of 1978. Before that, Weider had resurrected Scott's old column, a very popular feature in Muscle Builder. And suddenly Larry Scott was back in the limelight of bodybuilding. Once again, he was the recipient of hundreds of letters each week from bodybuilders who had never seen him in action, but had heard his inspiring history from their fathers. Clearly, temptation to venture out again on the muscle scene had been too much for Scott. He gave in and appeared at the Diamond Cup, finding himself up against other bodybuilders who may never achieve his status in bodybuilding, but who were in 1978 in better condition than Scott had ever been, even when he lived exclusively for bodybuilding. In the same way that Reg Park found himself out of his depth against the young and hungry Arnold Schwarzenegger in the late 1960s and bit the dust, so Roy Callender and at least a dozen other Diamond Cup contenders proved too much for part-time bodybuilder Larry Scott. The legend of the 1960s was overwhelmed by the monsters of the 1970s. This is not to suggest that Scott did not deserve his old glory. The man was truly amazing. Indeed, there are many in the bodybuilding fraternity who believe that, should Scott decide to train and diet with competition on his mind, nothing would stop him from rising to the top of the muscle pile again. Time began to tick once more.